All right, so next we're going to be getting into the major mechanics, right? So this is the third major section of the level design document. All right. So these major mechanics should be level specific mechanics that will be taught to the player and reused over the course of the area. So level specific are the key words there, things that you want to make sure you understand. It definitely needs to be something that is inside the level, that's not an addition or an attachment to the player. And we can go over that in more detail. All right, so there's two sections that you need to define within each mechanic. First, you have to describe what the mechanic actually is, right? So, for example, when we were saying Mario can jump, you'd want to go into detail. Mario can jump 5 units high, right? Or get into the details how the mechanic works. And more specifically, what are the player's actions, right? What are the interactions that the player does? So for a scraps example, saying, if you just say my major mechanic is exploding barrels, well, that doesn't really tell me your plan or how the mechanic is going to be used or the rules for it. But you could say, my mechanic is the mechanic I will be using is exploding barrels. When they come into contact with this type of material, right? You could specify if they come into contact with wooden objects, they will explode and break the wooden objects. If the wooden barrel, the exploding barrels can be placed near walls that have this type of symbol on it or this type of decal, and then they will be, destroyed. Start to get into that. Also, if the player is standing too close, they will take damage. Really start to define every rule for how the mechanic works. Same thing for force fields, right? You could say, force fields are in my level, but maybe you want to design a system to where you have a blue force field and an orange force field. Blue force fields allow only objects to pass through them, and orange force fields only the player can pass through them. And then you can say there's a console that allows the player to switch between both of the colors or allows them to interact. Whatever you're going to define, you can see just because we say force fields as a mechanic doesn't mean everybody's going to implement it the same way. There's still rules that you can define within that mechanic. So first figure out what those rules are. Then from there, you're going to describe 3 different setups that you're going to be using that mechanic, right? Like we say up here, taught to the player and reused over the course of the area. So that's what games are all about, right? If you see that and you start to, analyze games on that level, is that you'll notice that, there's systems that are taught to the player and then they're just reused over and over again in different ways, right? You try to get as much mileage as possible out of those mechanics, right? You have it in place, you've built it, now you want to use it as many times as possible, right? And it's our job as the designers to reuse those mechanics in different ways so it feels unique, it feels fresh every time, and it's not constantly repetitive, right? So if you just see we'll go back to the exploding barrels example. If we just have exploding barrel and then we have a wooden crate, and every time you just pick up the exploding barrel and throw it at the wooden crate. So it's every single time you see it, you do the same thing. That's going to get really boring eventually, right? But if you're doing different interactions, you're using the exploding barrels for different purposes, then it starts to feel unique and fresh every time. That's what you want to shoot for. So here's an example of what you want to strive for on your LDD. I'm not going to go through and read all of this to you, but you'll notice here this is more than just saying tripwires is my mechanic, right? We actually go into detail saying a physics object can set it off, right? So you can use a grab-null to throw it, and it goes into detail how the tripwire is going to work. Then we get into introducing, practicing, and mastering that mechanic, those 3 different uses of the mechanic. All right. So now we'll get into talking about those 3 terms: introduce, practice, and master. All right. As well as let's talk about some acceptable mechanics. All right. So some acceptable mechanics, like I've said a few times already: exploding barrels, right? Conveyor belts, pressure pads, pressure plates, any type of weight system like that. Force field, I mentioned that a few times, and springboards or any type of jump pad. something like that, right? So how the player is going to interact with these is definitely up to you. So what you should keep in mind with these is these are all level specific mechanics. All these are great examples of being level specific. So it should be something that exists within your level without changing the player's character, right? So the purpose of that and why you have to stay away from changing the player is because we want to make sure the player is consistent going from area to area. So say, for example, I really want to give the player double jump, right? So for some reason, I want to give the player double jump to make him jump higher in certain areas. So say we're all working together, right? A group of us are working together, and now the player completes my level, and then Joshua's level is next, and Joshua has his platforming section in his area, right? But I've already given the player double jump, so now all of the platforming in Joshua's area is broken. So rather than changing the player, we want to find ways to accomplish those same goals using level-specific mechanics, right? So rather than double jump, right? So I want to give the player double jump. Well, ask yourself, what do I really want to accomplish? I want the player to jump higher or reach higher areas. So a springboard or a jump pad will do that same thing, right? It will accomplish that same goal. But rather than giving the player to double jump everywhere, now they're only able to do it in this one location or where you place the springboards. It now becomes about the level design, about strategically designing places, about where the springboards are located to reach those higher places. Another way to accomplish the same goal, rather than double jump, you can have a collectible that can temporarily increase the player's jump height or movement speed or things like that. So you collect this item, and now for the next 20 seconds you have increased jump height. That is a way to do it as well. If you want to temporarily modify the player, that will work, right? But the level specific mechanics are the best route to take because it allows you to do a lot with just a simple mechanic with different ways of combining them. All right, so some unacceptable mechanics, things you want to avoid doing, right? Just like we've said, any permanent changes to the player, right? Keyword there, permanent. So if it's something that is only a temporary change, then and you can technically pull it off, then it will work, right? Or any functionality to the core mechanics, right? So say you want to add a Gravinol upgrade, right? You want to improve the Gravinol or modify the Gravinol in any way, or you want to add a black light to the flashlight, right? Or change the color of the flashlight. Any change to the core mechanic is also something you want to stay away from, as well as the core mechanics themselves, right? So saying that my mechanic is the Gravinol. Well, no, that is provided to you. That is a core mechanic. But you can use the Gravinol to support your major mechanic. So as an example, again, the exploding barrels, right? The exploding barrels are the mechanic, but the player can pick them up using the Gravinol, right? So that's a good example of using a core mechanic to support a major mechanic, right? So just some examples again, double jump, right? We just talked about that. A jetpack, right, is a permanent change to the player. A grappling hook, or a way to just give the player a way to swing from point to point, or a grappling hook is basically trying to give altered movement to the player. And there are other ways you can accomplish that, like with conveyor belts or with some type of level specific object rather than something the player can do everywhere, right? Or some type of skill tree or player upgrades or advancements, things like that. Again, stay away from stuff like this. Try to think of things that are level specific that you can add to your level, and then also add to the overall level that your team builds.